were facing apartheid, when we were facing oppression, he was not here. He did not fight side by side with us. And we were able, on our own, yes, with support of progressive forces in the world, to resolve the apartheid question. As far as I recall, Donald Trump was not around the negotiating table when we negotiated the end of apartheid. So stick around there in the White House. We will do our business here, and we will find solutions for our problem. So stay out of our issues, and we will not get involved in your issues in America. You have your own problems. Leave us alone.
Chinese President Xi Jinping says he is determined to deepen diplomatic relations with South Africa, no matter how the world changes.
China, Russia, we're going to work with them on our own terms. The Chinese don't go around Africa stealing anything from Africans. Your corrupt leaders overcompensate in exchange for something personal. That's what happens. The Chinese don't steal anything. One, they are in business. When the more you give them, the better for them. Why must they say no?
When it's doing well, to cooperate with Africa. If you go to Africa today, you see a big hospital. 99.99% probabilities that it has been built by China. If you see a big airport today that is new in Africa, it's a very high probability that it has been built by China. If you see a rail network that is new, know that it has been built by China. You see a big bridge that is new, it has been built by China. China is there for us.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa hosted the only state visit that we're going to see this week with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And this is an important meeting for these two leaders and these two countries. It is the 25th anniversary of these countries celebrating their diplomatic relationship. And these two leaders are talking about how to enhance their trade relationships and expand collaboration and trade on a number of sectors, from mining to agriculture and textiles.
Something major just happened behind closed doors, and Washington didn't see it coming. While the world was distracted by headlines elsewhere, South Africa quietly made a strategic move that could reshape global power for decades. Not a speech, not a protest, a decision. One that signals a deep shift away from the United States and toward China. This isn't about ideology. It's not about diplomacy. And it's definitely not about friendship. It's about leverage, because what South Africa just chose to do sends a message not only to Washington, but to the entire Western world. Africa is no longer taking instructions, it's making calculations. And once you understand why South Africa made this choice, you'll realize this isn't an isolated decision. It's the beginning of a much bigger realignment. A quiet shift is unfolding in global politics, one so significant that its consequences are still being underestimated. It isn't announced with sirens or emergency summits. There are no dramatic speeches or official declarations, yet its impact may be more powerful than any headline-grabbing confrontation. South Africa is changing course. For years, the global order has rested on a familiar assumption that Western influence in key regions was stable, predictable, and permanent. That assumption is now cracking. Not because of a sudden collapse, but because of deliberate choice, a calculated reassessment of interests, a realization that the world no longer operates under old rules. South Africa's pivot is not emotional, it is strategic. At the heart of this shift lies a simple truth. The global balance of power is no longer fixed, economic gravity is moving, supply chains are evolving, political leverage is being redistributed, and countries that once stood at the margins of decision-making are now shaping outcomes. South Africa has been watching this transformation closely. For decades, relationships with Western powers were framed as essential. Trade access, financial systems, security cooperation, these were the pillars of engagement. But over time, the returns became uneven. Expectations grew, conditions multiplied, pressure increased, and the sense of mutual benefit began to fade. At the same time, an alternative approach was taken from elsewhere, one built on infrastructure, long-term planning, and economic integration rather than short-term alignment, one that emphasized production instead of dependency, investment instead of instruction. This is where the shift begins to make sense. South Africa is not abandoning one partner for another. It is repositioning itself within a changing world. It is recognizing that leverage belongs to those who can offer markets, resources, stability, and strategic access, and that Africa now holds all four. What makes this moment so powerful is timing. Global supply chains are under strain. Energy markets are volatile. Food security has become a geopolitical issue. Advanced manufacturing depends on minerals found overwhelmingly on African soil. At the same time, populations across the continent are young, urbanizing, and increasingly skilled. South Africa sits at the center of this reality. It has infrastructure others rely on, financial systems that anchor regional trade, industrial capacity that connects Africa to global markets, and diplomatic influence that reaches far beyond its borders. Choosing new partnerships is not a gamble, it is leverage being exercised. This shift has sent quiet shockwaves through Western capitals, not because it was loud, but because it was controlled. There were no dramatic warnings, no confrontational rhetoric, just a steady recalibration of priorities that left long-standing partners asking a dangerous question: when did we lose the initiative? The answer is uncomfortable. Influence fades when it is assumed rather than earned, when engagement becomes conditional, when partnerships feel one-sided. When the future is discussed without offering a seat at the table, South Africa and Africa more broadly has learned from decades of experience: development is not promised. It is negotiated, growth is not given. It is built, and sovereignty is not symbolic. It is exercised through choices. This is why the shift feels unsettling to those watching from the outside. It challenges the idea that Africa must align itself with existing power structures. It reveals a continent increasingly confident in its ability to shape outcomes rather than absorb them. It shows that partnership is no longer about history, but about trajectory, and trajectory now points toward diversification. As South Africa strengthens ties beyond traditional channels, it sends a signal to the rest of the continent, a signal that alignment is optional, that competition among global powers can be leveraged, that Africa's role is no longer reactive. This is not a rejection of the West, it is a redefinition of relevance. The world is entering an era where influence is measured not by legacy, but by adaptability, where cooperation is earned through mutual benefit, where power belongs to those who understand the future before it arrives. South Africa understands this, and that is why this moment matters. Because if one of Africa's most strategically positioned nations is willing to recalibrate its global relationships, others will follow, not in unison, not overnight, but deliberately, quietly, strategically. The implications stretch far beyond trade or diplomacy. They touch energy security, manufacturing dominance, technological leadership, political alignment, and the architecture of the next global order. This is not a story about choosing sides, it is a story about choosing strength, and as the world begins to grasp what is happening, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. Africa is no longer adjusting to the global system. The global system is adjusting to Africa, and this shift, slow, strategic, and unstoppable, is only just beginning. The consequences of the shift did not arrive slowly, they arrived all at once. What began as quiet recalibration quickly turned into visible disruption across global markets. Trade analysts noticed unusual patterns: first contracts rerouted, negotiations paused, priorities reshuffled. Long-standing assumptions no longer held. Deals that once moved automatically were suddenly questioned, delayed, or renegotiated on new terms. This was no longer theoretical, it was operational. Western institutions reacted with confusion. Policy frameworks built for a predictable world struggled to respond to a reality that was no longer cooperative by default. The language of partnership began to change. Confidence gave way to urgency. Influence, once taken for granted, now had to be defended. The pressure intensified when financial signals followed. Capital flows began shifting direction. Infrastructure investment, once concentrated in familiar corridors, started moving southward with intention. Manufacturing commitments expanded. Energy agreements grew longer and deeper. Supply chains reoriented around reliability rather than tradition, and the ripple effects reached far beyond one country. Regional economies aligned more closely. Trade within Africa accelerated. Cross-border logistics improved. Industrial zones multiplied. What had once been fragmented markets began to behave like a coordinated system. The result was leverage not symbolic but measurable. This changed everything, for decades, access to global markets, was mediated through external gatekeepers. That dynamic was now reversing. Africa was becoming a gatekeeper of its own, deciding who participated, under what conditions, and for how long. Western policymakers felt the shift immediately. Emergency briefings were called, risk assessments were revised, diplomatic language softened in some areas and hardened in others. The confidence of certainty was gone, and markets noticed. Commodity pricing adjusted, strategic resources gained political weight, long-term planning replaced short-term extraction. The world was entering a phase where control over production mattered more than control over narratives. Africa held the advantage, not because it demanded dominance but because it offered stability in a volatile world. As global uncertainty increased, predictability became the most valuable currency. Africa's demographic momentum, resource depth, and expanding industrial base offered something few regions could: growth without saturation, opportunity without exhaustion. This recalibration unsettled established powers. Their models were built on continuity, their strategies assumed compliance. Their influence depended on alignment that no longer felt automatic, and when alignment weakens, competition intensifies. Different global actors began accelerating their engagement not out of generosity, but necessity. Infrastructure proposals multiplied, trade missions increased, diplomatic visits surged, each sought to secure position before rivals did, but the terms had changed. No longer were partnerships defined solely by access, they were now defined by contribution, local value creation, technology transfer, workforce development, long-term commitment. Africa set the rules. Those unwilling to adapt found themselves sidelined, not rejected loudly but excluded quietly, and quiet exclusion proved far more damaging than public confrontation. The global response revealed a deeper truth: influence is fragile when it relies on habit rather than respect. Africa understood this. As momentum grew, political confidence followed, positions in international forums shifted, voting patterns changed, negotiation stances hardened. What once required consensus now required consultation. The world was adjusting slowly at first, then rapidly. And with every adjustment, Africa's position strengthened. Financial independence expanded through new systems and platforms. Regional currencies gained relevance. Trade frameworks reduced reliance on external intermediaries. The economic architecture was being rewritten from within. This was not rebellion, it was evolution. Western economies faced a reckoning. Their internal divisions made unified response difficult. Competing priorities clashed, strategic focus fractured, and in that fragmentation, influence diluted. Africa, meanwhile, moved with cohesion, not perfect unity but shared direction, shared understanding, shared urgency. The consequences became impossible to ignore when global corporations followed the shift. Headquarters relocated, research hubs expanded, manufacturing capacity increased, talent pipelines diversified. Africa was no longer a future bet, it was a present necessity, and necessity reshapes behavior faster than ideology ever could. As investment deepened, domestic confidence surged, local industries scaled, innovation accelerated, youth participation exploded across technology, finance, agriculture, and energy. The psychological shift matched the economic one. Africa no longer waited to be chosen. Africa chose. This marked the most critical consequence of all. Power is not just about resources or markets, it is about decision-making. Authority. About the ability to say yes, no, or not yet, about controlling timing rather than reacting to it. Africa gained that authority, and once gained, it could not be reversed. The global order did not collapse, but it bent. Old hierarchies softened, new centers of gravity formed, influence became negotiable, respect became mandatory. Those who adapted found opportunity, those who resisted found isolation. The world entered a phase where leverage belonged to those who could offer growth, stability, and scale at the same time. Africa offered all three. One reality becomes undeniable. This is no longer a shift in preference. It is a shift in power, not announced, not celebrated, but fully in motion. And as the consequences continue to unfold, the question facing the world is no longer whether Africa is rising, it is whether anyone is prepared for how high it will go.